And the last thing that I will mention to you, dear brothers and sisters, in this regard, as far as how you transform yourself, what does the Ramadan makeover look like for you? You're going to be reading the Quran in Ramadan, possibly more so than any other time of the year. And I want you to read the Quran with an eye on the ayat that talk about character. If you were to take the first 10 verses of Surah Al-Mu'minun, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ, until the end, the first 10 verses of Surah Al-Mu'minun, and you were to take the 10 verses of Ibadur Rahman at the end of Surah Al-Furqan, and the servants of the Most Merciful, and you were to take the verses of Luqman al-Hakim speaking to his son, and you were to take the verses of Surah Al-Ma'arij, إِلَّا الْمُصَلِّينَ, and then the section that follows on the second page of Surah Al-Ma'arij, and you were to take Surah Al-Hujurat. I gave you 5 sections to look at. And of course, there are many more sections. Surah Al-Nur, which talks about modesty, haya, and different things, right? But these verses, the first 10 of Surah Al-Mu'minun, the last 10 of Surah Al-Furqan, the verses of Luqman al-Hakim talking to his son, the second page of Surah Al-Ma'arij, and Surah Al-Hujurat, Surah Al-Adab, the verse of mannerisms, and weigh yourself against those descriptions. SubhanAllah, the amount of tadabbur and tafakkur that could be done, the amount of contemplation that could be done by looking at those things and saying, where do I measure up to these things? Where do I measure up to these verses? And I'm going to share with you something, SubhanAllah, that I find beautiful about Islam. When you study other religions, one of the things that you'll appreciate about Islam is that Ramadan does not introduce anything that's out of the ordinary for the believer. What does that mean? Like most religions, when you study their festivals and you study their holidays, they do things in those holidays that they only do in those holidays. What is Ramadan? Ramadan is an increase of the things that you already know how to do for the promise of a greater reward. You read more Quran, you pray more, you fast more, you give more charity, but there is nothing that you do in Ramadan that you only do in Ramadan. That's why, by the way, SubhanAllah, one of the wisdom that the scholars mentioned, that Ramadan is only mentioned once in the Quran. You ever thought about that? SubhanAllah, it's so central to the believer and it's only mentioned once in the Quran. Because everything that Allah calls you through in the Quran is merely intensified in Ramadan. That's in regards to our ibadah, but also in regards to our character. So I want to leave you with this thought. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ, Allahumma ja'alna minhum, Allahumma ameen, and the servants of the Most Merciful, الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا, those who tread the earth lightly, and when the ignorant accost them, they say, salam. Isn't this exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said, that when one of you is fasting and someone annoys you or aggravates you, فَلْيَقُلْ إِنِّي صَائِمٌ إِنِّي صَائِمٌ, I'm fasting, I'm fasting. Isn't that just the Ramadan manifestation of قَالُوا سَلَامًا إِنِّي صَائِمٌ? I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to fight you. When you're driving, by the way, إِنِّي صَائِمٌ, the other driver doesn't have to hear you say it. But the other driver can see the opposite of them. So, يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا, you should also drive on the earth lightly. Don't get into it with people. Salama, inni sa'im. وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. What's the next verse? Tell me, what's the next verse? وَالَّذِينَ يَبِيتُونَ لِرَبِّهِمْ سُجَّدًا وَقِيَامًا, and those who take to their chambers in prostration and in qiyam, in standing. SubhanAllah, if you look at almost all the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ talks about character during the day of Ramadan, it's distinguished by your ability to maintain your composure, your patience. So whoever does not give up قول الزور, false speech, idle speech, al-fuhsh, foul language, who responds to the ignorant with ignorance, responds to aggravations with greater aggravations. It's not a person who's truly in a state of siyam. Siyam is to hold yourself back. You hold yourself back from food and drink and intimacy. You hold yourself back when you deal with the people as well. And that's the first way that the day of Ramadan is distinguished. The night of Ramadan is distinguished by sujjadan wa qiyamah. It's distinguished by people that are in their qiyam. And this is the description of Ibad al-Rahman throughout the year. How do they develop the reservoir of patience to deal with Allah's creation? They take to a beautiful relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the night that fills them up. And so they come out in the day, nashitan tayyiban nafs, good spirits, with energy and iman. They come out having already generated something from their homes. وَالَّذِينَ يَبِيتُونَ لِرَبِّهِمْ سُجَّدًا وَقِيَامًا. Ramadan is an exercise of what your life could look like with Qiyam al-Layl. All Taraweeh is Qiyam al-Layl, by the way. Ramadan is an exercise of Qiyam. And then what happens? What's the next verse? I know there are Hufad here. وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا وإذا خاطبهم الجاهلون قالوا سلاما والذين يبيتون لربهم سجدا وقياما والذين يقولون ربنا اصرف عنا عذاب جهنم إن عذابها كان غراما إنها ساءت مستقرا. That a person begs Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove me from the punishment of the fire, because its punishment is indeed horrendous. What a horrible dwelling and a horrible way to spend your afterlife. And what is it that you're going to be saying in the last 10 nights of Ramadan as you're pushing yourself in Qiyam? Allahumma innaka afuwun tuhibbul afwa fa'fu anni. Allahumma innaka afuwun tuhibbul afwa fa'fu anni. The best thing that you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for in the last 10 nights is forgiveness, is His mercy. And so if you're coming to your Qiyam and you've got this long list in Laylatul Qadr, last 10 nights, I'm going to ask Allah for this house, this job, this spouse, this car, this whatever, and Allah's going to give me this, and I've got my wish list, and I'm going to make it in the last 10 nights. The greatest thing that could be decreed for you that night is that you're amongst al-utaqa, amongst those that are forgiven by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we learn from our Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allah has utaqa, people that He frees from the hellfire every single night. There are some people that will be freed from the hellfire, written from the freed from the hellfire on the first night of Ramadan, some on the 20th of Ramadan, some on the 25th of Ramadan. Every night Allah has a group of people that He spares, that He writes down from their utaqa. What's the next verse in Ibad al-Rahman? وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا أَنفَقُوا. Those who when they spend, they don't spend extravagantly. وَلَمْ يَقْتُرُوا. So they don't do israf, they don't hold back. But they spend at a moderate pace. Ramadan is the month of sadaqah. And it's not a month in which you destroy yourself with your charity, but it's a month in which your wealth is put into such perspective that it really doesn't mean as much as I thought it did. I find more joy parting from my wealth than I find attaining it, because my priorities have changed. And so my whole conception of earning has changed. What do I really want to earn? Ramadan is a transformation of priorities. And so, dear brothers and sisters, as we enter into this month of Ramadan and we think about transformation, again, I want you to establish a baseline for yourself. Think about the best Ramadan that you ever had before. And say, I at least want to get there. Then think about the best version of yourself that you were before. And say, I at least want to get there. Then read the Quran with the lens of character. And say, I'm going to hold myself accountable to these verses. Then transform the daily components of your life by connecting them to the goals of your afterlife. Then have hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَنَّ اللَّهَ يُحْيِي الْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ مَوْتِهَا. that Allah truly gives life to dead, barren land. And so Allah Azza wa Jalla gives life to qulub al-qasiyah, to hard, dead hearts. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala soften our hearts with the Quran. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be written amongst those who are forgiven in Ramadan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transform us in Ramadan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to have the best Ramadan of our lives. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring out of us through this Ramadan the best version of ourselves. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to salvage the gains from this Ramadan so that they extend beyond Ramadan.